everyone. Welcome to the first episode of our podcast, You've Got Potential.
We are beyond excited to share with you this project with the objective of encouraging, sharing, and discussing undergraduate research and researchers here at Rutgers University.
The pandemic has been a catastrophic moment in history, and there are no words to express how hard it has been for the whole world.
We were inspired by this time of hardship to create a platform that aims at bringing hope and motivation to young students who have an appreciation for research but were significantly faced with obstacles in their efforts to have a fully immersive research.
This podcast is something very exciting to all of us because we really felt strongly the impact of COVID in all of our lives. And when it comes to being a student researcher, especially if it's something that brings you joy and happiness to do research and discover, it's definitely terrible to have lived through this passion with the COVID pandemic. So I guess we can start with giving all of us a little bit of an introduction as to how we went about our lives with COVID.
I really want to ask you, Eric, about your work in NMR, because I started doing a research project on PAGSE NMR for diffusion. So I'm curious as to what sort of work you do.
Okay. Well, that's kind of the tricky part because most of my work thus far in this lab has not actually focused on NMR. Most of that's been done by the grad students in my lab. And I was going to analyze some NMR spectra using this piece of software called CCP NMR, but the problem is, for some reason, it just didn't work on my computer.
Oh, no.
So we had to move on to doing something else, and then I focused more on different purification experiments we were planning, and also some codon optimization procedure we were trying to do, which that in and of itself was kind of weird. So a lot of technical difficulties were encountered, and that was not the only one, but that was probably the big one that stopped me from doing anything NMR related because we just weren't able to figure it out.
Have you been able to get back on campus yet?
I might have been able to, but as far as I can recall, I don't think I ever thought it was necessary because most of the stuff I was doing was stuff I could pretty safely do from home and various, take codon optimization as an example. To explain a little bit what that is. So basically, when you're expressing a gene in an organism that didn't originally contain it, sometimes a lot of tRNAs that are used, if you can recall back to your biology classes and whatnot, they're going to be fairly rare in some organisms compared to the ones that originally have that gene. So adjusting the sequence of the gene to still code for the same protein, but use more frequent tRNAs. And also, that's not even the main factor, but that's one of many factors that we consider when trying to make a foreign gene easier to express in an organism. Now, I was working with a service provided by this company called GenScript. I know I'm going on a bit here.
No, you're good.
Yeah. So I was working with them, and it was a little weird trying to get this set up because there were some very technical, more business-oriented questions, like how much of this gene do you want to order? Where do you want it on the plasmid, so on and so forth. And I was kind of tasked as the middleman working for the lab, the man met. But it turned out that we didn't end up needing to do that. So we kind of just moved my project on to focus on something else because, I wouldn't be the right person to answer those types of questions about what the lab needed, but at the same time, I feel like I did a lot of background research that didn't necessarily translate into the people who would have to do those orders. They wouldn't get much use out of it.
That's actually like that's pretty interesting that it seems like COVID hasn't completely derailed you, which is like pretty awesome. I'll have to say that I liked your explanation on the genetics and protein work that you do. It's like you learn in biology or introductory genetics, like central dogma of biology, and it looks so simple. It's like, okay, DNA to RNA to protein. That's generally how it works. That's not the kinked out details, but generally how it works. And it's like, well, there is so much in there, entire fields that are nested in there, and that's incredible. Monica, what about you? How has COVID affected your research?
Yeah, so after we were kicked off of campus, I wasn't able to well, kind of
Booted.
early. I wasn't able to go back until I want to say like uh September, November, I think.
And just for perspective, like when did you leave? So what's that, like the spring, right? March, something like
Yeah,
that?
March,
Yeah.
I think. I was actually like, we got the announcement that like we were gonna be remote for the rest of the spring semester, like on my birthday, or like
Yeah.
the day before my birthday.
Oh.
And then I was just that's like mid-March, and we were just kind of like, oh, so I'm never going to see you again, haha. And then we actually never saw each other again.
Right. Everyone thought it was like
Like,
we're
oh,
gonna be gone for a month or 2 months, or the rest of the semester, but that everything will be
yeah,
back in the spring. I mean the fall.
yeah, yeah. Well, hopefully next year. But yeah, the summer was completely online. Remote research for me was not as it was not as easily translated as Eric's project. I don't do a lot of computation unless I have to do like data analysis, and if I can't acquire any data from the lab, then I have nothing to analyze. So my summer project was basically like literature reviews, which I found out that I did not
I
appreciate a
was gonna
lot.
say that that's so boring.
So bad. It was so bad. And it was like not like I wasn't disinterested. It was just very separate from what I had been working on. So I felt like it wasn't contributing anything to my thesis.
Right.
Um, so that was also like not super motivating. But then after I got back to lab, it was slow, but it started to pick up again. Um,
How is the work in the lab been now? Like, do you go in and you feel energized doing your work, or is it still like the restrictions have kind of made you feel like how you were in lit review?
oh no, the lit review was like a different story completely. It was like so bad. Um, no, I definitely enjoy like actually being in the lab and getting like hands-on experience. Georgia's nodding her head just like vigorously.
Oh yeah.
And
Oh yeah.
I can tell. Um, but yeah, I mean the social environment isn't quite as vibrant, obviously. A lot of lab members, I think it was only limited to like 2 or 3 undergrads, in my lab at least.
Oh.
So I mean, it was a little better because I work at a larger facility. I work at the Keck Center, so it's like
Mhm.
a group of different labs,
Right.
all in one like area.
So is it like you're in a subgroup and then there's like other groups that are all under your PI sort of structure?
Uh, it's actually like multiple PIs in one
Okay.
like building or
Yeah,
room. But yeah, I mean, it's slightly better than like working in one like small room with like
definitely.
one other
Yeah.
person. But yeah, it's okay. I'm not complaining as much anymore.
Good. Be
But
thankful, right?
yeah, for sure,
Yeah.
gratitude.
Yeah.
How
I think
about
that's like a
you?
big theme. Um, Georgia, how's your experience been?
Yeah, I was just about to tag along as to a
Yeah.
particular word that Monica used, which is motivational. My experience was actually a little bit different from Eric's and Monica so far. I was in a different lab when the pandemic started, and we were working on a fellowship project that had just started at Rutgers. So we were in the process to gather data, like behavioral data from birds, in order to deliver our project, which involved training an algorithm with data that we were supposed to record, but also come up with different ways, so adjusting behavioral paradigms in order to better fine tune our project. And clearly, isolation and being sent home significantly impaired our project, in the sense that we had basically limited data to train our algorithm. I mean, we made it one way or another, but it definitely would have been nicer to have more time in person with the birds and with the team to really kind of support each other. I think a very overarching theme when it comes to the pandemic, regardless of research or whether it's classes also, is that it's difficult sometimes to find the inspiration and the motivation to get to do work. Because I mean, at least in my experience, whenever I'm at home, my mindset is home, family, like
Mhm.
no
Yeah.
conversations, relaxing, at least as much as it can be done as a university student, you know. So having a lot of very important deadlines along with learning school work and like taking exams and stuff, it was eventually kind of led me to take a break from research and anything really over the summer. Like I was supposed to do a lot of things, also like literature review for a paper that um, my lab was working on, but despite all of my efforts, I just could not get in the mindset to actually do it. And I really commend you, Monica, for being able to do it, because it does take a lot of like willpower to be there and
Yeah.
read through things when you were like really not in a best place. At least I
Yeah.
wasn't, to get to it. But the fall started and I was really just realizing, okay, you know what? I learned all of these things. I've taken all of these classes. There is something else that I'm looking for, along with trying to get better myself with like going back into research and stuff. So through a professor of one of my classes, I got introduced to my current PI, and being able to finally be in a lab again and work on things, learn new methods and how to put together a protocol and like how to enact it and stuff. It really just was life changing for me. Despite the fact that also, as Monica said, the sociability or whatever the word is
Right.
of the lab is limited because there can be just so many people in the lab, and like it's definitely isn't as vibrant as it would be in person. Also, I don't know if you guys can relate, but in my building we have to swipe 35 different doors to get in, so it's like if you
Yeah.
forget your ID, you're like
Done.
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 Literally,
I
not to
forgot.
say something else, but you're
I
done.
I lost my ID like around the time
Sorry.
that Corona hit, and then I tried to come back for research, and it was so bad. But I like that you commended Monica for being able to get through lit review, because Corona hit like around the same time that I joined my current lab, and so I was in lit review for like forever. And with yeah, Monica's shaking her head, and it's like there's a few different reasons. It's hard to focus at home and all that, but also like not being able to compare the literature and connect it with the experimental methods is it provides no context for the work that you're doing. It makes it really difficult, in my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, like an overall feeling of disconnect and just like disjointed, like little articles here, little articles here. I don't know about you guys, but when I was assigned my literature review, it was just kind of like, here's your topic, have fun. And I was just like, I've never done this before. I don't know what I'm doing. So I just kind of like treated it like, those high school projects where they were just like, all right, this is a library, this is a database, write a paper. And then that's what I did. And they were just like, oh yeah, good job. And then nothing really came out of it anyways. So
I think that's like the funny thing about like getting into research. Had you been in a lab before that, Monica? Is that your first lab that you've been
um,
in?
yeah, so I entered my lab in freshman year,
Mhm.
and then I stuck with it uh, to now.
Yeah, I think it's like hard when like the biggest shock to me was the amount of like free reign you get in research, and then it's like there's no structure, and so you're just like, oh wow, like I have no directions. They're literally just giving me a topic and they're like, go play with it, right? And that's great. Like I think that's like everyone who wants to do research, like that's really like the type of personality you might need to be. Maybe I'm not gonna make that absolute, but But during the coronavirus epidemic, it's like if you're starting out and you have no direction, zero, not like it's hard to meet up with a mentor and all these sorts of things. It's very, very, very hard for sure.
I would actually like to ask Eric, how was his experience? Because I've talked to him about it. He talked to me about his experience with this lab. And I think he would be a great example for all of the students who, like him, and like all you two guys as well, were in a situation where you got started in a lab, but like never actually got to see the lab, but were also involved with the research project, with a research center, like a RESTI that had, let's say, some requirements. So like you have to deliver something, you have to produce a product, you have to show them you did something, you know. So I really want to like hear from Eric, how did he navigate this freedom but also this need of delivering something?
Right.
Okay, so a bit of backstory. First off, this project that I started in the fall is actually the very first research lab I've worked in. I've done lab stuff in prior courses, but this is my first long-term project. And looking back, I really appreciate the fact that the Arresti program leveled those demands on making a poster, on having something to present, on having some sort of structured report that you have to write at a certain point early in the semester, just to get you beginning with the end in mind in a way. Because for me, it's very easy to, when you're doing some background research, I didn't have to do any literature review, though I was encouraged to look over some articles just to get a little bit of background on the stuff the lab was working with. But when you're doing that, it's very easy to get caught up in all sorts of terminology and all sorts of questions and details you might really not need to address, but you want to understand the field more, so you can kind of go down the Google searching rabbit hole where you might
Yeah.
learn a lot in the
Wikipedia.
process. Yeah, you might learn a lot, but it doesn't directly contribute to research. So admittedly, there were some times where maybe I wish there was a little more attention paid to the deadlines and what I would be able to achieve by then. But I think there was a pretty strong focus in my lab from the beginning, getting something that I could present on keeping the constraints of the Arresti program in mind. I appreciate
It sounds like then that Eric, it sounds like you have like a pretty good you've had a pretty good experience so far. And that's something that really like to be fortunate for. I guess Aresti provided good structure for you.
that. However, there was a clear gap in expertise that did make it kind of hard to know what it was I needed to do.
Mm,
And there was this temptation for me to learn all the basics of NMR and how these techniques work. You know, my peer advisor forwarded me some very detailed and informative lectures about the subject that ended up not being that critical to the work I got done
right.
on the project. So in a sense, I'd say that I had a good experience in that I learned a lot, but at times it can be kind of a frustrating experience because of how much the focus in the project jumped around, how much technical difficulties got in the way, and the sense that what I was doing in the beginning was very different from what I ended up with.
Yeah. I think like that's a really important message because like two things are a really important message in that I like the word you use, technical difficulty, because I think like research projects like are just full of technical difficulties. Like they're just like so many things. It's like on paper, like if you read a paper and they're like carry out this procedure, you're like, yeah, no problem. Then you go and do it and you're like, what is going on? There's no detail here. Um, and then the second thing that I liked what you said was that you started off somewhere and then you ended up in a completely different place. And I think that's like that truly embodies like the spirit of academic research, which is like you start going down the rabbit hole and you end up in like all sorts of places. I think like that's what like might be common to researchers is like a like tenacious curiosity, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and on that note, I know Monica was about to say something. I think it's important to note the way that the personalities that you end up working with can affect the direction of your research as well. Because
Right.
I tend to be a pretty curious person. I've been aware of this for a while now, and it seems like a lot of the people in my lab are as well, judging by how many questions I would get regarding the way that codon optimization, as I mentioned before, works, and how some of the questions were very well, all the questions I'd say were well meaning, but it seemed like a lot of them were very detached from what I was doing,
Hmm.
which I can't blame them for being curious or being focused on their own projects. These are grad students sometimes,
Right.
but it does seem like oftentimes when you have a lot of people who are very curious and idealistic all in one place, there isn't as much of a pragmatic pressure to focus in on one aspect of the project and really take that far and get a lot done with.
Right. Right. Actually being able to execute. I actually have the opposite in my lab. It's very much like people will give you tons of ideas and stuff, but my mentor is very focused on like execution. Like pick one, execute it, go all the way through with it, see if it works. If it fails or it doesn't work as well as you wanted it to, optimize it or change the topic. Monica, was there something, because Eric mentioned you wanted to say something?
At one point, I wanted to say something to the effect of um, going back to that feeling of detachment that everyone seems to be feeling, being able to just like pop into someone's office and be like, hey, could I talk to you about this? Or just like that, like quick communication that we were lacking because it's all under the vise of like Gmail and like
Right,
the amount of
right,
emails we get is just so overwhelming now. Um, and that makes communication not only like, or I don't know, in my opinion, it's much more labored, but it's also like the burnout of just having like 50 emails a day.
yeah,
Like you don't want to, you don't want to
yeah. And I
talk
don't
or
want to
ask
check my
questions.
email like 100 times,
Yeah.
you know? So yeah, no, I definitely can relate to that.
With regards to that, I would like to ask how many of you plan to do research in person in the following months? With regards to specifically the sense of detachment, has any one of you felt like your relationship with your PI or like the grad students you work with has like, I don't want to say deteriorated, but definitely gotten more like there's more distance between the two of you, or like maybe especially on communication online, I feel, as any one of you felt like it was difficult to ask things because of being online? Because I know personally I was extremely lucky to have the opportunity to learn everything I'm doing right now in my new lab in person, and I have a lot of support from the people in my lab, but I know it's not the same for everyone. I know a lot of people who did most of the work online or who are in labs that are like maybe very, very big and like everyone is very stressed. Um, like some professors have mentioned that they lost a significant amount of student hours that were necessary to carry out significant
Hmm.
advancement in research. So I mean it affected everyone, but I wanted to, especially I was curious about like relationships with the people we are around, and how did that play out with being online or maybe being partially in person and stuff.
So like one big thing that I think is important, like across all of life and not just like your work, is like personal responsibility. So I started, I agreed to 7 hours of lab work per week, which is like 2 credits or something like that. Um, and I was doing that when I was fortunate enough to come into person finally. But it just wasn't enough. And so the personal responsibility is like you need to come in a lot more. Like way more. At least for me, I needed to come in a lot more. And my relationship with my mentor and my PI, um, I'm very bad at reading people, so I'm not going to say it was deteriorating, but it definitely couldn't develop to the point where I wanted it to, because the I was mostly doing like Monica was doing like lit review and that sort of thing. But then once I started taking it upon myself to just come in every day for 6 hours, 7 hours, and build a relationship with my mentor and my PI, definitely things have gotten better. The weekly meetings are a lot less stressful, and I'm actually learning stuff in the lab. That being said, I'm not going to be doing research in person like June and July. I was fortunate enough to find some online work in bioinformatics, which is like really exciting because I want to learn more about protein biology. But starting in August, I'll be back in my normal lab, and that'll be great. So
Yeah. Is it like an internship or?
yeah, yeah. I mean, the label is it says internship. So there's the it's called the Center for Quantitative Biomedicine or something like that. I think that's what it's called. And there's a chemist there who's actually my PI's wife, and I didn't know that when I was interviewing for it.
Oh,
And she was just like, yeah, your PI vetted you. Sounds good. So you're starting in June. I'm starting in June 1st. Yeah, yeah. And so there's something called the protein database bank or something like that. And then so now they're trying to build. Well, they have it already. It's called the nucleic acid data bank. They already have that, but they're trying to streamline it and make it better. So nucleic acids have different properties that make them useful for all sorts of things, including like DNA and RNA. But when researchers are trying to study this, there are certain attributes of them that they want to find. So they only want to find, for example, nucleic acids that have this like specific type of structure or this specific type of function and things like that. It's hard to find that. Like, how would you search that on Google? It would be very difficult. So we're trying to create search options that make it easier to do that. So hopefully I get to learn a lot about like nucleic acid structure.
that's like super cool. I could never, but that's like super wonderful. Um,
What sort of research are you doing again, Monica?
yeah, so I'm doing spinal cord injury and recovery.
Hmm.
So mine is like a step further from like the biochemical structure of things.
Right.
Um, so like slightly leaning into more translational studies, hopefully going to in vivo experiments sometime before I graduate. But yeah,
Is that in the
fingers
medical
crossed.
school?
No, it's still at Rutgers. It's cell bio neuroscience department. My facility is called the Keck Center for Collaborative Neuroscience.
Hmm.
It's run by Dr. Wise Young, who's like the face of spinal cord injury, at least
Hmm.
on the East Coast, I want to say. But
That's awesome.
yeah, it's like pretty cool. He was my professor in one of my classes, and he's like super into everything spinal cord injury,
Right.
which is like it's nice to see that people have this passion. But going back to Georgia's question on like lab member relationships, I actually think like yes, the summer was bad for everyone. I was like very frustrated with the lack of like support and direction, which is understandable, obviously, because I
Right.
know they were writing a paper, they were trying to get things grants finished, and also have to deal with like 0 students in the lab. Even I think they had to get out of the lab for at least a month. So that was just like a complete stop on everything.
Hmm.
So I understand, but at the same time, it was also detrimental for the undergrads. And I think actually we lost a lot of undergrads in our lab.
Oh,
Before Corona, I think there was like I want to say 13 kids, like under
that's a
one
lot of
PI.
undergrads.
I
That's a
know,
lot.
I know. Once I got back into the lab and once I was able to like start um, conversing like face to face and like talking about the nitty gritty pieces of my project, I was able to get uh, I don't want to say more productive because there are other factors involved, but more understanding into my project. So yeah, I think having more like one-on-one time with my
Mm.
PI and my postdoc is actually like something that helped. And I was fortunate enough for them to consider me as one of the undergrads to bring back. Um, I think it's partially because I'm one of the only ones who's considering a PhD. Everyone else
Right.
is like pre-med. Um, and that's just a bias of academic research in
No,
general,
yeah.
which is slightly unfortunate for y'all pre-meds, but
You have to remember,
um,
it's like they wanna train scientists, and it's
right.
like there's a lot of doctors, MDs and DOs that end up doing research in their career, but it's hardly a majority of them. It's not definitely not a majority of them. Very small minority. I guess that's redundant, right? But
And I would just like to call attention to a point that Monica brought up before about how you guys seem to have hit on this really resonant theme of just how often it is that PIs and other people involved in research projects will be thinking in the long term. Okay, where is this person going to be a few years? And I see them helping me in my lab when they're practicing. Makes sense when you're someone who has to write a lot of grants to begin each time you write something like this with the end in mind. And the unfortunate consequence of that, however, is that sometimes slotting people into that long-term plan isn't always so easy. Like when it came to my lab, for instance, I got the sense that yes, I was an active participant in the project and I was doing a lot of things that were contributing to its long-term success, but there wasn't as much attention given to what I would be presenting in the Arresti program itself. Would I have some sort of coherent project with clear results by the end, or would I have a bunch of scattered contributions that kind of piece together in the grander scheme of the project?
Yeah, I definitely experienced that prioritize prioritization of long-term goals over like that one progress report, in my case that one progress report at the end of the semester that I have to write. And it's very much and I'm not in the Arresti program as an RA. You're in the RA program, right? I'm not just okay. Right. So I have never had to present a poster. So my research has just been like, this is what I did in the semester. This is all the troubleshooting that I did. And then I'm sorry, I just signed up for like a symposium because I'm like, okay, I have to like get practice and presenting and stuff.
yeah.
And then I did make a poster and I'm like, oh my God, this doesn't make any sense at all. So I can definitely understand that lack of direction for like short-term goals. And then I also wanted to mention, or actually, Georgia, first, how has your relationship been with your lab members?
Well, I would say in one word, phenomenal. I think my lab
That's great.
was a phenomenal place to be in, to grow in as a researcher. And I mean, all of my labs, I would have to say, have given me so much. And when I say the latter one was phenomenal, it's the most recent experience, the one that I'm actively working on at the moment. But it was definitely a privilege, like I've mentioned earlier, to be able to go in person and have a lot of attention because the lab is new and the professor has just recently arrived at Rutgers. So oftentimes it was just 4 people, actually 3, depending on like when students are coming in, because we want to be careful of like COVID regulations. And I was able to like get a lot of firsthand like lessons from my PI himself or from my lab tech. And yeah, I would say like it was really, really a phenomenal opportunity for me to learn with that circumstance, but also to keep myself in a bright mindset and really relearn little by little my love of research and my wish to do it long term. Because I don't know, I mean, like just not being able to do it for the whole summer when I'd made a financial investment to like be in New Brunswick to do research all summer, and then clearly that wasn't possible. It was very heavy on me to like bear it and feel motivated and in love with research again. So I am very grateful for the opportunities that I got and for the people that I worked with. And I actually wanted to touch up on a point with regards to like relationship with PIs, but also time and research. Venkat earlier mentioned that he now goes up to like 6 to 7 hours every day at lab. And regardless of like travel time additionally,
Hmm.
something that I feel like was also difficult for me to navigate within this pandemic is time. Whether it is because uh, like have not having the motivation may lead a student to maybe procrastinate longer during the day, so that there are more deadlines a lot closer together, and then it's difficult to really navigate. Or maybe like recorded lectures, sorry, are like difficult to follow in the sense that we may get distracted. So one thinks, oh, you don't have to get the bus to get to class, you have so much more time now, but like
Right.
you actually have to like rewind the video 53 million times because you keep getting distracted. At least that's my case. How was your experience with being able to continue to do research despite though still having to balance the fact that you have school, you have classes, you have to learn, and you have to take exams that are a lot harder than in person, um and things like that, like how did you manage to do everything at once?
Yeah, that's a really, I think it's a really good question. I'd like to answer it only because my, like you brought up transportation time, like my transportation time to get to lab is very high. Um, so I think like the best way to think of it is like, I don't know the nature of your guys' experiments, but at least for me, that's how it is. I have to like if I'm running a reaction, I have to wait a day or so. So like it's like making sure that you do not waste time. Like you plan your day, you plan your experiments, and then you go to the office and you just sit down and you do your work, and then you go back, and then you go do the next experiment, and then so on and so forth. It's like really like making sure that you are on top of your game all the time, because it's like what other option do you have, like you need to get your coursework done and you need to get your lab work done. I think it really helps if you actually like your work. If you don't like your work, then it'll make things like really really difficult, like you're fighting an uphill battle. But it's like time is an issue, but ironically, the solution to it might be spending more time in the lab, because I found that once I got in the lab, I was much more motivated and curious and sort of like excited by the work I was doing, that I could sort of manage to get through like little bits of coursework that I might not have liked otherwise. I actually like had like the senior scientist in my lab like made a joke while I was talking. I was like, yeah, like I'm really glad to be in the lab now. I get to, like I get to touch everything and I get to smell the chemicals and all this stuff, blah blah blah. And he's like, you shouldn't be smelling the chemicals, you know.
You have to waft it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I was like, you don't get it, man. Like, well, no, he gets it, obviously. It's like, I'm very thankful to be able to smell these volatile, probably harmful chemicals. So yeah, that was my experience with it. I don't know if you guys are in the biological sciences, maybe the setup for experiments and things like that are different. So I like to hear from you guys.
So my experiments are also some of them can be time sensitive. So if I like do a cell culture, then like I have to incubate for at least 24 hours before I can like add my compounds or whatever. So I also have to be careful with time, and also like coordinate with other people in the lab if we're like doing experiments together, like in parallel, so we like save resources, or if we like alternate shifts for a behavioral test or something like that. So it's both managing my time and other people's time.
Yeah.
And I'm part of like 3 different Google calendars now. uh, so yeah, it's been overwhelming for sure. And I also towards the end of last calendar year, I was getting very anxious about like my graduate school preparation, and so I actually joined another lab, like in in collaboration.
Right,
So
right.
I'm working with 2 professors now in the Keck Center,
That's awesome.
which is super cool because
Yeah.
it's like two different aspects of the same project, so like two different approaches, um, two different parts of the timeline as well. But hopefully it comes together before I graduate. Um, and it's been super cool to get those experiences. But at the same time, it's so much more time.
Yeah.
I would like to say that it doubles my time, but it honestly probably more than doubles my time in the lab. So yeah, I've been talking to my advisor about like adding extra credits onto next semester because
You deserve it. You deserve that work.
I don't technically need them.
Yeah.
Because like yeah, what I just don't need them. But yeah, it's been tough for sure to manage everything. But at the same time, I am more like uh sometimes I'm more like motivated to like get my actual coursework done. Then Kat mentioned that he does some of it in the lab. So yeah, so sometimes I'll have downtime while I'm like waiting for something to run. And so I'll just like quickly like watch part of a lecture, type up some notes, stuff like that. And I've had lectures and like my Zoom is running while I'm at the bench, like with my pipette, and which is really bad.
No, you're good.
That's
You're
just
good.
how it is.
You're good. I've done the same thing. I literally had my
Right.
phone plugged in while I was running catalyst synthesis.
Yeah, for sure. And like I was at the cryostat. It's just like it's basically where you like section tissue, but like in a freezer for your hands, so that the tissue maintains its integrity. And Georgia's like having such a reaction. What?
Yeah, I just feel like my hands are gonna like be snipped off every single time I work there.
Yeah, I know. The only reason why I think I can handle like I've done up to like 6 hours straight at the cryostat. I'm telling myself it's okay. I know. I'm telling myself it's because I'm a figure skater and I'm like I should be used to it. But honestly, it's just distraction. Like I have to have my phone, like a Zoom meeting, like a YouTube video. Honestly, I've like streamed Hamilton on my on my
I
phone
love
while I've
that.
done that.
Hamilton's great.
But yeah, it's very much a mental battle as much as it is like a logistical battle. Um, because even if you dedicate that time to something, like Georgia said, you have to like push to make sure you're actually doing what you said that you're supposed to be doing. But yeah, that's just been my experience. Eric, how about you?
In my case, I've actually had almost no work that's been relatively urgent. Admittedly, there are the intermittent deadlines with the Arresti program, but those are very few and far between. For the most part, everything I could do in my lab was not very time sensitive because it's such a long-term project. And I think because of that, there might have been this sense, perhaps between me and the people in the lab, that, okay, we can take our time with this. Things aren't immediately going to be producing this very satisfying payoff, more like gradually building on top of a very complex project. Because the way that I originally had my Arresti project pitched to me was that a bunch of students would be hosting their own semi-independent sub-projects related to different expression and purification protocols for proteins we're studying. So because of that, everything was very decentralized, but there was also the sense that we could spare a lot of time. And I don't think I had many problems with focusing on my research, but I don't always think I was focusing on the right aspects of it. As I kind of mentioned before, there were some technical difficulties that did work in areas I wanted to get to. There were other cases where the expectations weren't always clear, like whether or not we needed to get codon optimization done fairly recently, and so on and so forth. So I kind of ended up getting shuffled around between a lot of smaller duties, and it was very tempting for me to kind of be complicit in having that role because it felt like I was part of the lab. It felt like I had a lot to do, and oh, I won't have any problems getting this done, at least in the state I want it to be in time. So if there's any piece of advice I would give, it's that sometimes it's important to just have those moments where you're not getting lost in the research you're doing. It's very easy to be enthusiastic about something, but it's not always as easy to step back, size up your project, and say, okay, I have a presentation due, I have something else due. What do I want to get done within that time?
Mm.
Trying to keep that in mind very regularly is important because, especially in a remote environment, it's difficult for other people to keep track. You kind of you'll have to manage your own schedule.
Right. And the thing is like with everything on being online, it's like if we're trying to take an optimist view, we're undergraduates right now, and so a lot of things are like sort of like relatively speaking, they're actually pretty structured for us. Um, Imagine being a graduate student and like, okay, like everything is up to you. Like that's your job now. You don't have classes. Well, you know, in the beginning you have some classes, but for the most part, like everything is completely unstructured. So if I'm trying to take an optimist view, I would say that like this sort of trial of the coronavirus epidemic in the context of young researchers is, I don't want to use the word preparing because it's like I wouldn't suggest that you do this, but it's definitely something that I think will make people better for it. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts, agreements, or disagreements with that.
Yeah, it's kind of like exposing you to a worst case scenario. So it's like optimal flexibility and ability to adapt is kind of being unfortunately like forced on you. But yeah, like if you're a grad student, then like you can do anything after this. Like if you can handle the coronavirus, you can probably handle
Yeah.
anything.
One
Or
thing else I wanted
okay.
to, sorry, no, finish up. Oh, one thing I wanted to ask you all, because I think this is like a really important topic for maybe like underclassmen. I wanted to hear from you how each of you found research and what was your journey to the uh, lab that you eventually settled with and really liked. So it seems like at Rutgers, at least, there's two main paths, which is Arresti or sort of word of mouth slash connections, maybe.
Cold emails.
Yeah, cold emails. Yeah, cold emails. That's good. That's good. Yeah. So I wanted to hear maybe you guys. We heard a little bit on it already, but I'd like to hear how everyone got it.
With regards to this question, I would like to ask also in order to be sensitive of time, after you're done telling your story, maybe you can share a little bit of advice, both with regards to a general world situation, like how would you suggest a younger student joins a lab,
Yeah.
or with the current world situation, what can students do to get started into doing what we are doing and we love doing?
Mhm.
So I just want to like add that to Venkat's question.
That's a really good addition. Yeah. Um, Eric, I know you're in the Arresti program, so maybe we should start with the more formal path of Arresti. I'd like to hear about it.
Okay, so I applied in the spring of 2020, and while this wasn't my first time applying to Resti, it was the first time where I ended up getting into it. I had been interviewed in, but this time around, the deadlines actually got pushed back very substantially. There were like, I think, three different occasions at least where they pushed them back. And I was afforded a little more time to browse a bunch of different projects. Now, the Arresti Research Assistant Program has this big list of different projects that you can browse. And I went through basically every one of them at some point, just taking a cursory look to, okay, is this something that I think would be interesting? Would this serve my potential career goals in the future? And if it didn't pass that test, okay, I could safely dismiss. But then I would try to narrow it down to a few that seemed very interesting to me. I would not only look at the work being done, but also the level of independence afforded by the work, because I had heard from people in the past, especially a TA in one of my classes, that it's very easy to get sucked into a project where you're just doing pipetting and you're not
Right.
really engaging
That's so
with
true.
research in that much of a critical fashion, or being that involved in experimental design or anything that you wouldn't get in a traditional lab course. So I looked into that and I settled on a project that seemed not only very relevant to me, but also very independent. And I knew the person in charge of it because they were a chemistry teacher.
Mm.
So once I started sorting out based on my preference which one of these programs I would apply to first, because I had limited time. It was in the middle of the really awkward transition to online learning, so I didn't know how scheduling, filing all these applications, and you have to write an essay for them was going to go. So I did that. I was able to send out a maximum of 3 applications. That was another important thing. The OST program traditionally only allows you to send out 3, but this time around, they afforded another additional 3
Oh,
at some
wow.
point. Yeah, so I ended up doing
Lot.
6.
Yeah, that's a
And,
lot to write.
and then I got a pretty substantial number of interviews out of those. I think I got like 4 out of 6. And it seemed pretty clear that I was going to have a decent amount of choice in the programs and I was still adamant about going through with my first choice, which was the program that I'm in now. And I'd say the whole process went out relatively well. I had my essays reviewed by people I knew just to see if I was doing a good job at conveying not only what I wanted about the project, but also my capabilities, and doing some background research on the PIs themselves and what they did to have a sense of, okay, what am I getting into? And how can I show them that I understand? If there's any advice I could give about this whole process, I would say I'm pretty satisfied with how I structured it. You know, just looking over programs a little bit, not getting too lost in the weeds of, okay, maybe there's some really small specific thing I could get out of this, but just starting with the broad strokes and then gradually narrowing down and focusing first and foremost on what you want. Because scheduling can be weird sometimes. You're not always sure about how easy it's going to be to write an essay that you think satisfies you, or to find the background research that you think will meaningfully contribute to that essay. So it's better to start off and prioritize things like that than it is to keep going back and forth between all the different programs you could look for and writing essays here and there. Like once you're done with small set that you're comfortable with, I'd say if you have the time, go right ahead. But much like with my project itself, I would say beginning with the end in mind is very important. You don't need to know all these projects. You don't need to know everything about every project. So getting stuff done in waves where you start off looking at over everything very broad way, and then you start writing essays. So just compartmentalize it is what.
What so when you were looking at I think the big thing is like look into the background of the PI. I think that's like a huge component of it. What sort of things did you personally look for? It will definitely vary between people, but it's good to hear, I think.
Mhm. So I looked primarily on the Rutgers pages for the different PIs I was searching for, because they often list publications that they've made.
Hmm.
I also will sometimes just look a little deeper into a field and try to find details that stand out to me as particularly interesting, try to find stuff that contextualizes their work in the real world, because I find that showing the importance of your work would probably demonstrate a much greater appreciation and knowledge of what you're doing than just bringing up some random facts that happen to be related. Or, oh, I saw this paper you wrote and I thought that was pretty cool. You want to convey that you understand what this research means.
Cool. Yeah. No, I think that's a really good perspective. So you went the more formal route. You were fortunate enough to get a lot of different options, and then you sort of looked into the background and sort of did a little like soul searching on what you wanted out of your career, and then went from there. And it sounds like it turned out really well for you. What about you, Georgia?
I would say with regards to the two traditional routes, I fall more onto the, I wouldn't say cold emails because that would be a little bit of a stretch, but it was mostly from kind of word of mouth plus emails. So I started university thinking I wanted to do something completely different from what I'm doing now. And then I met someone that was doing research in that field. And while I was a little freshman who knew basically a little bit more than nothing, I still felt like I had to take whatever opportunity was thrown at me.
Mm,
Going back, I think the first advice I would give is what Eric also mentioned. Make sure you research, you look up a kind of research that you think you would be interested in, whether it's code words, whether it is a whole field, a whole topic, like I don't know, cancer. Like make sure you start with something that fits your interests, because once you do get in a lab, regardless of whether it's like a random or like word of mouth type of situation, it is a lot of work, like we've mentioned earlier, and it's a lot easier to get it done when you feel very passionate about
yeah.
both the work itself, but also I would say the methodologies as to like how is that particular topic being observed within that particular lab. Because something about research is that a topic is like a very big concept, very big like pool of information that you can feed into it. So some people may look at it with a particular lens, whereas some other people may look at it with another. So yeah, I think my experience at first was like being thrown into a topic that I wasn't extremely passionate about, but I was like, yo, experience. I soon realized that wasn't the kind of topic, both topic and methodology that I was interested in. And then I went to, I mean, I still was very interested in becoming like a researcher, like as a profession. So I tried to be as involved on campus as possible with regards to clubs and opportunities that were focused on research, but also follow research centers like Aresti that have an annual symposium or other opportunities for undergraduate students. So I went to the symposium and I went around, looked at the posters, and at a certain point I stumbled upon one that was giving a little bit of an interview, and I recognized a few code words from an Aresti website that I had read about a couple of months earlier. And I was like, oh wait, this is a lab that I was interested. Let me ask them some questions, talk to the student. And one thing led to another. He was leaving the lab. So he was like, you know what, you seem very curious, you seem very interested in this lab. Let me tell my PI about you, and then maybe you guys can set up an interview.
That's pretty cool.
It was amazing. I mean, like it was beyond generous what the students did for me, especially considering, again, I was coming from a completely different field. I
Hmm.
had no real clue how to talk about science. Like you actually mentioned before, like how do you navigate that moment of like awkwardness when you're like in a new lab with new topics, new words. It was definitely a little bit challenging at first, but this new lab was very keen to my new interests in like animal behavior and instinct and I don't know, neuroscience. You say it like it's just a very wide mix of things. And yeah, so that was my second lab, kind of a little bit networking, I would say. And then being in that lab, I was also at the same time taking classes. I learned new topics. I realized, you know what? I went from a very big picture to this medium picture, and now I realized that I like to study things at even a smaller scale. I fell in love with molecular biology, organic chemistry, and I realized, you know what?
Oh yeah.
I think this is a lot more similar to something that I see myself doing forever. And kind of, I would say, paradoxically speaking, a year before the pandemic started, I fell in love with a book about the pandemic of 1918, which led me to be interested in viruses. But honestly, we'll see where that will go given the whole year we've been in. But anyway, so then after that second lab, like I've mentioned earlier, I've had a little bit of a break during last year's summer. I was like a little bit confused. I didn't know what I wanted to do anymore. I felt so unmotivated. So I gave myself a little bit of a timeline. Okay, Georgia, you're gonna like look at professors, kind of like what Eric mentioned. I'm gonna like stalk their Rutgers pages, read their publications, see what is the kind of research they're doing at the moment, because that's also something that can be misleading. Sometimes the Rutgers pages give a very big overview of what the topic is, but to read the publications, or at least even just the introduction to what they're doing
Yeah.
within the papers, gives you context as to what they're doing at the moment, or like most recently, because it happens that maybe, like, I don't know, I was interested in a particular professor doing a particular kind of research, and then they told me, listen, I'm not doing this, I've been doing this for like 10 years or something. So it happens, and it can be unfortunate, but it's part of the searching process. But yeah, so I gave myself a timeline. I was like, okay, you have to like find a new lab by this day, and like try to follow with these topics and stuff. But then, kind of out of my timeline, it happened that with one of my classes, my professor was very adamant with of getting students in labs as soon as possible if they weren't in one, or if they were thinking about switching. And I had one thing in mind at that point. Okay, I have like 3 days to respond to this thing. What do I want to do? And the first thing I wanted to do was like, I really, really, really know that I would like to settle within this topic of like molecular biology, like biochemistry research. But my previous labs were something different with regards to methodology and topics. So I want to like learn techniques as to like how can we perform this kind of research nowadays. And this professor put me in contact with my current PI, who is a phenomenal person, phenomenal mentor, and I was able to learn a lot of things with him and in my time spent at that time. And yeah, I would say again, do something that you feel like you're interested, but make sure that with your interests comes background research of whether they are met in the lab you're going into. And with regards to that, I would say when you look up a laboratory and you're like, listen, this is so cool, I want to do this, I feel like this is where I fit, don't shy away from emailing that person right away. Tell them, listen, I love what you do, it's very cool. It would be so amazing for me if you gave me the opportunity to learn about your research a little bit more. And you can try suggesting, is there a possibility for me to join your lab meetings so that I can get a little bit of an introduction as to what you're doing right now, kind of listen how you guys speak about this topic. And one thing with cold emails is that you should not feel too upset if they don't reply. As Monica said earlier, there is such a thing as an email burnout, or like just generally being overwhelmed with emails from everything. So what I was told in the past is that if you are sure that someone is doing a topic that you do love, persevere. Maybe don't be obnoxious so that you email them every other day, but like you email them a day and then maybe you get back to it like a couple of weeks later, or like a week later, or like you add information and you continue looking up their project. There are cases when like professors are not looking for students at the moment. Like for example, right now with PhD applications, it's very important that whenever we find a lab that we're interested in, reach out to the professor before and ask them, are you recruiting this year? Are you taking in new students? Because that is a possibility. But the privilege of being at Rutgers is that it's a huge university. There is so much you can learn, so much you can do, so much you can be exposed to, and take advantage of that. That would be like my final words with regards to this.
Yeah, just going off of what Georgia has been saying about how to get into a lab. I talked with one of my PIs about like what she recommends students to do in their lab searches right now, and she just wants like everyone to know that because of coronavirus, like obviously spots are limited. I think I'm not too sure if the policy has changed officially, but it has been like 2 to 3 undergrads maximum. and has usually been limited to like juniors, seniors,
Yeah.
just to like make sure that they have their hours to graduate or get into whatever professional program they want to apply to in the future. And because of that, there's a good possibility that people might not get their first choice, which is unfortunate. But again, like Georgia said, Rutgers is like such a powerhouse of a research university, and so we have like so many options. So one of the main pieces of advice that my PI gave is to apply to like as many as you can, like just cold. Well, I prefer to cold email. That's how I got into my lab. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do your research, right? So like take what Eric said and like look at the background of your PI, what they're doing, and then reach out. And then also if you can, like if the lab that you're interested in has a website, sometimes that's also linked to those Rutgers pages. Look for grad students, postdocs, or maybe even undergraduate students who are in that lab, and like talk to them, because sometimes the PI will like maybe give a romanticized version of the lab, or like their version of like how they manage projects, but you don't really get that perspective of like the undergrad experience. So talk to people who can give that to you, either through email or any other way. I run like a very preliminary mentorship program in my club, almost single-handedly actually, now that I think about it. But I've been trying to really get people into research. So I've been helping people with RSD applications, with like cold emailing professors, like asking people for help. And I think it's like super important. So I'll link my PI's information because she provided her website and everything. I guess I could like put that in the description, as well as actually the RSD RA program information, so that you can get both types of experiences. So like Eric's path and also like the cold email path. I'm just gonna call it that from now on.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, so that way you can get different perspectives of the types of paths to get involved with research. And then my own research journey has been more similar to George's, I think, except I kind of stuck with the lab that I first got into, because I was also a freshman. My first professor was very research oriented. He was actually an MBB professor, and he was very like, yeah, you guys need to get into research. I'm like, oh my god, I need to get into research. And like CBN, it's not a requirement, and I obviously didn't know that, being the dumb freshie that I was.
Isn't that weird
But
though?
right, I know.
Like they should
Like,
require that for sure.
right, I know, because like everyone's pre-med and they're just like, yeah, I couldn't be bothered with that. But I'm just like, I'm PhD.
Yeah.
I need to do something. So yeah, so I kind of like panicked after my professor was like, yeah, this is how you cold email professors. And so I did, and my PI was just like, yeah, here's your interview time, go talk to my postdoc. And when I got to the interview, he's like, okay, so this is the project we're thinking about. I'm like, aren't you gonna ask me if I'm like qualified?
Yeah.
Like, I could be a total dumbass, you have no idea. But I guess
They know everyone's not qualified.
yeah, we're all stupid. But yeah,
They're gonna skip that
especially
part.
if you're but yeah, especially a freshman, it's difficult for them also, because if they get freshman applicants, they have more time to teach them and to like really hone in those research skills. But now that they're only allowing juniors and seniors, it's very difficult for people who with no prior research experience to like really develop those skills in the time that they have left. So it's affecting both ends of both parties really. Georgia mentioned that like in general labs have lost a lot of undergrad hours, and I think my PI said like 200 hours a week of like loss of undergrad hours. And I was just like, oh, that's ridiculous, but I guess that makes sense. So basically, what needs to happen is that we need to get back to research in the fall. But yeah, that's my piece. Then Kat, how did you get into your lab and how is it
Yeah,
affected now?
yeah. So I actually started off in a lab in the social sciences, and the reason being was just because well, at the time I was really interested in personality psychology, and they were doing a little bit of work in that lab, and I also wasn't very concerned too much about like uh, medical school or graduate school or whatever post college plans in general. So I was like, yeah, I'm interested in this. I'll get my hands dirty, and then I wasn't, I found that I wasn't very interested in the project as much as I thought I'd be. Um, and so then I left, and then I was a little disillusioned with research until um, eventually in my Orgo class, my future PI came in as a guest lecturer to give a presentation on his current research. And he was like, you guys are interested, just email me. And, we'll select we'll select one or two out of how many people apply. And so I emailed him and I looked into him, and very prominent in his field. And I liked that he was more on the industry side of things. And I was definitely more on the industry side. So I liked that a lot about him. And he had crazy publications, so many. And he was all over the place. He started off in physical chemistry, and he's ended up doing, like, I think this summer he's going to like Yellowstone to like study bacterial genetics or something. Like, he's all over the place. He's everywhere. He's just all over the place. He's like the dream of what you would want to be when you're a professor. Um, so yeah, so I was like, this is a great idea. And then I joined the lab, and then Corona hit it like immediately after that. But yeah, so that was a little bit, I guess, atypical because I didn't really look too much for it. I did do the cold emailing when I was underclassman, and I got pretty much the response of like, we're either not taking undergrads or no reply at all, which is like, don't take it personally if you guys do that. Like, it's not a people are busy. Um, so, but what I would recommend for freshmen or sophomores or whatever year you are to get involved in research is, um, if you are a nerd like probably everyone else in this Zoom call, you're probably into like pop science. So you've watched like Neil deGrasse Tyson, or used to watch like Nat Geo and stuff like that. Yeah, yeah, Monica's laughing. Honestly, like, that's not a terrible place to start. Like, think about the big buzzwords that are going on, things that are really important to society, and think like, and for every field of science there is, right? So there is one. So neuroscience, there's all this stuff with like AI and all these things. Um, what else? Genetics. There's like genetic engineering and CRISPR and all this cool stuff. And so every field has their buzzwords, and work backwards from there and see what professors are working on it, because it's like, yeah, those are the things that are going to be changing society. So you should get involved in that. Yeah, so do that. Then look up professors, get familiar with faculty. I think someone mentioned before they use the word networking. To break that word down a little bit more, it means like truly getting to know faculty in your department or whatever department you want to conduct research in. So for example, the other day I was running NMR samples, and it wasn't working as usual. And so and so the guy, he's the senior director of like NMR research or something at Rutgers. He came by to help, which is like crazy. And while he was there, I just started picking his brain about NMR theory. And so it's like getting to know people like that, like going out of your way to make conversation, even if it's small talk, I think is really good. Being engaged in your classes, if you don't have the opportunity to interact with professors or researchers, you at least have your professors in your classes. So definitely interact with them and put a genuine effort. Go to office hours, be curious, ask questions. All of that will help.
I think we had a wonderful, wonderful discussion. I'm so happy right now to have just like been able to do this with you guys. We will be delivering other episodes, and we hope you have a great time and that you enjoyed this podcast. And stay tuned and remember that you've got potential.